Well, once again, welcome everybody to another speaker series here at St. Luke's. I'll give you a warm welcome this morning since we've already had a very cold welcome on the way to church this morning. Also, welcome everybody online that's going to be watching this, I think, beginning Monday afternoon. Those of you who don't know me, my name is Nathan Napier. I'm a member here of St. Luke's, and I also serve on the lay ministry team, so you guys may have seen me around the altar or shaking hands at the door. What I'm going to be presenting, I don't get paid to do. I don't work in a scholastic environment or in education. However, I do work in the private sector, in the business world, and have been doing some form of bivocational ministry for about 2 decades. So during my bivocational ministry journey that started 2 decades ago, I decided to pursue some advanced degrees along the way and accumulated those. And back in December of 2021, I actually finished some doctoral work on the intersection of faith and culture. And specifically, the stuff that we're going to be talking about this morning in terms of the religious demographic of nones. And my doctoral work was really all about mapping religious expressions in non-religious persons. That's what I did. So, to kind of give you an overlay of where we're going to be going over the next several weeks, because this is the first of 3 weeks, we're going to be talking about kind of the lay of the land, framing the problem, and then next week we're going to talk about what I call signals of transcendence and religious expressions. And then the week after that, we're going to talk about some practical ways to work within those things to share our faith. So very systematic and linear in fashion, and that's going to be the direction for the session. But I wanted to share with you briefly why I was interested in this research to begin with. When I was at seminary, probably around 2006, 2007, I had a conversation at work, and we were talking about how we make meaning in our life. You know, how we solve problems, how we make meaning, how we get our bearings, how we get a grip in the world. And I remember making a reference to the story of Samson with someone who was a senior in high school at the time. And Samson being, in terms of children's stories, like a larger-than-life hero until you grow up and you actually read the story and you're like, wow, that guy was kind of messed up a little bit. But he was this larger-than-life hero when you're a little kid, and I was simply using as an example of how stories can help teach us good lessons and also what not to do, how to behave and how not to behave. And when I was talking about Samson, this individual was looking at me like they had no idea what I was talking about, not even on the radar. And I left work that day thinking, something is changing. I went to a Christian university, I was raised in church. The Bible is my bubble in terms of biblical frames and narrative worldviews. But that conversation began to show me that there is a generation coming up that does not have the same biblical sort of background and understanding and foundation. They don't live in the stories the way that I did. They weren't in my bubble. Well, then I graduated seminary in 2008 and did ministry for about 10 years. And there started to emerge a demographic trend. And that was this trend of individuals we call nones, or people that when they're asked on surveys what your religious preference is, they can say Protestant, they can say Catholic, they can say Episcopalian, Lutheran, Hindu, nothing, atheist, agnostic. These individuals say nothing in particular, don't have a religious preference. And they can also say that they're atheist or that they're agnostic. All these three fall under this category of nones. This was just now coming on the scene around 2008, 2009, in terms of awareness. In terms of awareness of people in church and church leadership and some of the shifts that it was going to create within our culture. So it began to be something that people were more and more paying attention to, and I started to hear murmurs that I didn't think were probably correct in terms of stereotyping this new rising demographic of non-religious persons. That they're hostile to religion, that they have no religious sentimentality, that they're just people who were raised in church and then they left and now they want to live however they want to live. I felt like maybe that wasn't the right way to characterize these folks based on conversations I'd had and things that I'd read. So as I got a few years into my ministry, I decided let's go and pursue a doctoral ministry degree, and I wanted to focus in this area of specialization. So that's what I did. And specifically, my degree, I worked with people who were not non-religious that left the church, out of whatever frustration, but people who were actually not raised in church at all. So people that we would probably call completely secular. Never had a born-again experience with Jesus Christ, just didn't have that sort of bearing. So people who grew up in a world without any sort of Christian framing intentionally. And that's where I gave my focus. Now, the term nons, in terms of what we call these individuals, really didn't come onto the stage until about 2002. And this is where we'll get to our presentation. So in 2002, something precarious happened. There was a paper written, Why More Americans Have No Religious Preference, Politics, and Generations. But the occasion for the paper was some statistical changes that we noticed from 1991 to 1998. So in 1991, when people were asked what their religious preference was, 7% of adults asked that question would say nothing in particular, no preference. That 7% was what it was through the 70s, through the 80s, up through the early and mid-90s. But then in 1998, the percentage jumped from 7 to 14%. And that got the attention of sociologists and demographers. Like, what gives? Why this sudden change over the past 25 years, this number has been holding steady? So they wrote a paper trying to investigate what could have caused this. And as you can tell from the subtitle of the paper, Politics and Generations, that's where these two authors, who were two sociologists at UC Berkeley, their names were Michael Hout and Cloud Fisher, they said that the political changes that happened in the country in the mid-90s and also the aging population contributed to more and more persons identifying as non in terms of their religious preferences. So I don't have time to go through that paper today, but you could Google it, you could look it up online and kind of get a synopsis of kind of what they argue there. And if you fast forward till 2012, so from 1998 to 2012, that number of 14% of persons that say they're non-religious, it jumped to just under 20% by 2012. So really, for 20, 30, 40 years, these numbers have been really steady. And then what seems like just yesterday, the last 30 years, things have shifted at a breakneck speed in terms of demographics and religious identification, religious practice in this country. But before I go further into the American situation, I just want to kind of frame it globally so you see what sort of context this American shift is happening in. So in his book, Brent Myers wrote a book called Engaging Globalization. He notes that 100 years ago, there were 600 million Christians in the world of 1.6 billion people. 70% of those Christians lived in the West, so Europe and North America. But today, 100 years later, 60% of those Christians are in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So we've had what a lot of missiologists or people that study mission work talk about as a hemisphere shift. It used to be a world divided between East and West. Now it's a world divided by Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere. The Southern Hemisphere being the one that is more religious, and demographers believe and sociologists believe that that's going to increase over the next 50 years, that the Southern Hemisphere, these other pockets, are going to increase their religiosity, making the world more plural and more religious, while the West continues its decline of less religious sentimentality, just like what's happened in Europe, will eventually migrate over here to the United States in terms of cultural mood, which we're kind of already seeing. So what that means is, now today we have only a third of all global Christians that live in the West. 1/3. All the rest are in the Southern Hemisphere. So it also means that we're talking about a global shift. We're not talking about just something that's happening in Tennessee or in the South. We're talking about a global shift that we're now a part of. So how do we go about analyzing these things? How do we go about determining how to make sense of the shifting landscape? Well, there's a few different ways and means that we go about doing that, and a few different pollsters and things that you can look up online to get a grip. One of those things is the General Social Survey. If you see this online, it's going to be abbreviated with GSS. And they've been doing surveys on religion in America and sociology since the 1970s. Another one is the Cooperative Congressional Election Study from Harvard University. That's usually under the abbreviation CSS. There's Pew Research, which everybody knows Pew. Pew is the one that makes the news, gets in the newspapers and on your internet articles. There's Barna. Barna usually produces books. They do a lot of research as well. So the material I'm going to be presenting in terms of statistics to kind of frame the percentages for us today in the new landscape really comes from a mixture of a lot of these sources. The GSS, the CSS, Pew, and Barna. I've went through a lot of them and incorporated them all into this presentation. Okay? But the first chart I want to show us is this chart. This is actually from a book by Ryan P. Burge that he wrote about 4 years ago called The Rise of the Nons. And for those of you who have trouble seeing it because the dots are kind of small, I'll just walk us through it really quickly. But what he did is put up a chart of American religion from 1972 to 2018. And as you can see, this line right here, we have evangelical, you can't read it very good, but it says evangelical, Catholic, no religion, mainline, black Protestant, other faiths, and Jewish. Those are the things on this chart here. But I want to point out just a couple of lines so you can see something, because something for the first time in history happened in terms of polling in 2018. So you see right here, this is us. This little line at the very top and that little spike, that's mainline Christianity. Lutherans, Presbyterians, Episcopalians. Early 70s was the high water mark in terms of polling. About 31 to 32% of the population claimed to be mainline Christian. 2018, mainline Christianity is down 20% in 40 years. 11%. And actually the statistics, the current statistics are about 9.5 to 10% of the population are mainline. You see here, this is the Catholic line. Catholics have held pretty steady. They were right here in the middle, so about 26, 27%. And they tailored down to the line to about 24%. So they've held pretty steady over 40 years. Just like if you notice in the very bottom line, the Jewish population, been pretty steady. Not big swings. But then if you look right here, it's kind of hard to make sense of it, so I'm going to go ahead and go to the next chart in just a second. But you have a line right here that says no religion. So what happened in 2018, for the first time in polling, Catholics, evangelicals, and people that identify as non-religious were all the same percentage of the population. All around 22 to 23%. People who didn't identify with any religious preference historically had always been behind these major Christian groups. And now, it's even. And actually, in recent polling, as recent as 2021, I started my Doctor of Ministry degree in 2016, and there was about 2 or 3 studies that came out, so that the stats shifted really quickly. But in polling done just last year that was published in December, non-religious persons are now 29% of the population. So now there's more people who identify as no preference in terms of their religious faith than there are evangelicals and Catholics, the 2 biggest religious groups in the country. So you can see how this trend line goes. Early 1970s, we're about 5% for people who talk about not having any religion whatsoever, or no religious preference. And then it shoots up to 23%. And that's why Mr. Burge wrote his book. He's an American Baptist pastor, and he also has a PhD in political science, and does a lot of work with these statistics and political and religious movements and sentimentality in the country. And now we have some more recent polling as of 2021 as well to kind of piggyback on that research. So the National Public Opinion research that was done in 2021 found that 63% of the adult population now claims to be Christian. Whereas you can see in 2007, the bottom line says 2007 to 2021. For those of you that may have a hard time seeing those smaller numbers, it was about 78% in 2007 identified as Christian. Now we're about 63%. And if you look at the individuals that claimed no religion, in 2007 they were 16%. And now they are at 29%. So what this means is that 1 in 3 Americans have no religious preference, and Christians now comprise 63% of self-identification. And most of the decline, if you look at it, most pollsters and sociologists put the decline in Christianity and the decline and the increase in the no religious preference, a lot of it comes from the big loss in mainline Christianity that was as high as 31% in the 70s and now is around 10%. So a big chunk of that 20% are individuals that moved from the mainline category into the non-religious category, as the other categories have kind of held fairly steady. So if you want to put a number on that, if we're around 29% of the adult population that now has no religion, 80 to 85 million people have no religious preference. That's a big number. I think Jesus said something like, the fields are ready for a harvest, but the workers are few, and the fields are getting more full, to say the least. So now I want to throw kind of a data blitz at you really quick. Won't spend too much time on this, but just kind of create a more full, direct picture. So we have a couple of generations at play, Generation X, Millennials, and Generation Z. So 45% of Millennials are nods. Nearly 1 in 2. What are Millennials? It depends on who you're talking to, but roughly 1978 to 1980 birth until like 1995. That's the millennial generation. 45% of millennials are nods, and with polling, millennials are the first non-religious generation we've ever had in this country. So if it feels like things have changed, like it did when I was talking to that individual at work 15 years ago, and they had no idea about the story of Samson, things have changed. Certainly. 45% of Gen Z are nods. So that's a generation that comes right after millennials. And they're the youngest Gen Z folks are born around 1996. So if you're ever having religious conversations within this generational cohort, millennials and Gen Z, and you got to break it down a little bit more, that's why. They're not growing up in that sort of narrative. In a lot of ways, the rise of the nods has been the eclipse of a biblical narrative as a framework for understanding our lives. Now, Barna did a poll, and what they found was that Generation X and Millennials are post-Christian. Or excuse me, Millennials and Generation X, 48% of Millennials and 40% of Gen X are post-Christian, or what that means is also unchurched. So Barna's findings were really close to the stuff that Pew finds out. And what that translates to is that there are 160 million people in this country that are not involved in any sort of church. 160 million people, which is 45% of the population. So is there any good news?
We're
Yes, is there any good news? So the first thing I want to talk about is when we see polls and we see headlines and you get these catchy things like religion is declining in America, the Bible is no longer useful, atheism on the rise, whatever sort of little catchy hot topic title you see, all these statistics, behind all the numbers are people. Remember that. People with real lives and real challenges and real hurts and real joys. All these numbers represent real people. But further, because they represent real people, it's important for the church to look at the world how it is, not how we want it to be. We have to have a clear eye about the field that we're going into. When Jesus calls us to the Great Commission, every generation needs to know where they're going, what that world looks like that they're being called into. So what these statistics do, even though they can be kind of dry and boring and flat, unless you just love statistics, they represent our cultural frame and everybody who are our neighbors and who we go to school with, people we sit in church with. So it's important to understand this context. And there are some silver linings to this. There is some good news. despite some of the bad negative trends and declines we've seen. But there is some good news specific to our American context. So, 88% of the population believe in God. 160 million people do not go to church, but 88% believe in God. Where do we get that number? Because roughly 11 to 12% of the population claim to be atheist or agnostic. But that's 88% that don't. 63% profess Christianity. So that's still not bad. More than half of the population has a positive view of the Christian faith and of Jesus. In recent polling, 45% of the nation prays daily. 45% pray every day. Now, I don't know what those prayers are. It can be a small meal prayer. It can be about to walk into a test. Lord help me, I didn't study. Whatever the prayer is, it doesn't mean they do the full morning prayer, but people pray. They seek help from a higher power, 45%. 22% of the people polled pray weekly to monthly. So what that means is, at least once a month, 7 in 10 Americans are uttering something in their mind or from their lips to a higher power for help or consolation. And of the wealthy nations, so compared to, say, European countries, in the United States, we have an incredibly high approval rate for religion, and people that say religion is important. 51% of our country says religion matters and is important. 51%. Now, to put that in perspective, what percentage of Germans say religion is important? 23%. What percentage of the French population says religion is important? 12%. So in a lot of ways, our high religious sentimentality, most historians believe, we have benefited from not having a state-sponsored church. In Old World Europe, where there was state-sponsored church, the declines have been precipitous. In America, and our libertinism and our history kind of saved us from that, and the downside to it. Now, sociologists also talk about religion as having three sorts of actions, and can be typified as behavior, belonging, and belief. So all religious people exhibit these three B's: religious behavior, religious belonging, or some sort of religious belief. So think about behavior as in, we all came to church today. That's a religious behavior. Prayer is a religious behavior. Belonging. Even atheists and agnostics fall under the belonging category, because they want to belong to something else, a group, a part, an ideology, a purpose. And belief. So people believe something. We believe something about the Bible, we believe something about Jesus, we believe something about the church. So only 1 in 20 people don't have any of those in their life that are polled. That's also really good news. Only 1 in 20 don't have any of the three B's that categorize people who are religious, which is behavior, belonging, and belief. But what that means is that the faith that's operative and the religious behaviors that are operative in our culture are more syncretistic. They're more of a mixed bag. Think of it like a bag of tricks or Lucky Charms. You just shake it up, you never know what you're going to get. Okay? It's not a boring bowl of Kix. I hated Kix when I was a kid. I have no idea who even invented that cereal. Sorry, that wasn't in the notes. It just reminded me. But let's get a closer look at this subgroup of nons, because this is where we really want to focus our time. So, of people who are non-religious, like we said, atheists, agnostics, and nothing in particulars all identify as a part of this group. But nons are not homogeneous. So they're not all the same. Just like all Episcopalians are not the same, neither are non-religious persons. So 5 to 6% are atheists, and atheists are peculiar to the effect that most of them are kind of hostile to religion. We've all met them. If you go into the Twitter sphere and go to like atheist Twitter, you'll be maybe not so surprised, but it can get pretty heavy. They never attend church, and atheists punch above the belt politically. Atheists are only 5 to 6% of the population, but more than half of them give to political causes and political parties. Evangelicals far and away outnumber them 4-1 or 5-1, but only about 20% of evangelicals give to political causes. So atheists are a small minority, but they are a vocal minority that punches above the belt in terms of culture. They are passionate about their belief and what they're against. So they are part of the non-group because clearly someone who's non-religious, atheism would qualify, right? Agnostic, they're slightly less hostile. Agnostic is simply a Greek word that means they don't know. Gnosis is the Greek word for knowledge. Agnosis is not really sure, I'm open to it. It could be one way or the other. 5 to 6% of the population is agnostic. They're still rarely religious though, but an agnostic is more likely to walk into a church than an atheist is. Maybe once a year for a funeral or a wedding, for example. But this is the interesting group. So when you look at these polls, and we've been talking about all these statistics, we've made big generalities in terms of non-religious persons and Episcopalians or Lutherans or mainlines or whatever. A lot of these statistics are just big, broad generalities. So what we're doing by breaking down how the non-subgroup is composed is we're seeing more the details of what nons really are. This is helpful for mission because it tells us where the most fruitful work can be done. Jesus talked about his disciples, when you go into a city and they won't listen to you, shake the dust off your sandals and just carry on. There's all kinds of memes out there in our culture saying, look, if people won't listen to you, quit giving them your energy. Go and give your energy to individuals that will embrace it, that want to talk to you, that want to live life with you, right? This is kind of the same principle in terms of what part of the non-group is going to be most receptive to the good news we have to share, or to listening to our experience with Jesus Christ, with the Lord. So 19% or 20% of the 30% of nons are that group. That's really good news. Now, they're just apathetic to religion. So it's the kind of person, you probably met him in public. If, they say you walk up to him having a conversation in the coffee shop and it just comes up in passing, oh, I go to St. Luke's Episcopal Church, I really like the people there, the community, etc. And then they'll turn around and say, yeah, I don't really do religion. It's whatever. Yeah, those kind of conversations. It's okay, but yeah, I don't really go. They just shrug their shoulders. That's this group. Nothing in particulars. However, we talk about ideologies and beliefs being sticky. So when atheists, agnostics, and nothing in particulars were polled at 4-year intervals, so like 2010 to 2014, the first two groups are really sticky. People don't move in and out of them. Once you're in it, you're in it. Unless you're C.S. Lewis and Jesus himself appears to you, you're in it. Okay? It takes seriously something like that, like the Apostle Paul, Damascus Road. But of the nothing in particulars, about 15 to 20% switch. And they become more religious, or they go into the basket of the atheist and agnostic. But they switch. It's not quite as sticky because they're open to being persuaded. Okay? And then there's also a group that kind of fits in the nons and is in nons and also some religious categorizations. And we call those the one that's become really popular. I know you've heard this. I don't go to church. I'm spiritual, not religious. There's even rock songs out there with that lyric in it. I'm spiritual, not religious. That can fall even in people who claim to be Protestant. So it goes into some of the non-stuff, and it also goes into the religious sentimentality. People are complicated. I'm presenting these statistics as if it's all cut and dry, but individuals can hold contradictions inside themselves. And it's important to understand that. So they don't always fit as nice and neat as we would like them to. But let's look a little bit deeper at the nothing in particulars, and then we'll look at the spiritual but not religious. So, nothing in particulars are usually not antagonistic toward religion. They're about 20% of the largest group in the U.S. So you want to talk about politicians wanting to get the votes of evangelical Christians? If politicians are ignoring that segment, they're do so at their own peril. That's now one of the biggest groups in the United States, 20%. Okay? 50-50 men and women. So it's diverse. And the group is more open to faith and spirituality. Now, spiritual but not religious, because I feel like this is still an important category for us as Episcopalians who center our faith in prayer. Our differences are bound by our prayers. So, in this church, we have Republicans and Democrats that go to church together. You know how rare that is in America? I thank God every day for that we have such a unity here through our prayer book and through the love we have one another. That's Christian gospel struck through and through. So this category of spiritual but not religious really plays into our spiritual lives as well as Episcopalians and those that put an emphasis on prayer. Because let me tell you, most people, if they're going through a hard time and you offer to pray with them, most will let you. Maybe if you will say, carry on, but most will appreciate a hug and appreciate a prayer. Spiritual, not religious. Okay? 48% of the population says that they're spiritual but not religious, so half. 27%, spiritual and religious, 48%. 27% is spiritual and not religious. That's up from 19% in 2012. Okay? So about 50% of the population, 48%, are folks like us in this room, spiritual and religious. 27% spiritual, not religious. And that kind of mirrors the non-religious category of around 29%. So there's one trend, though, in this group that I found even in my own research. Spiritual but not religious types have a negative view of religion. Religion is not good. As you can see from the state churches and the Christianity in Europe, religion, not good. Spirituality, very good. And when I was doing my research, I was talking to an agnostic non, a secular agnostic non. And he gave me a quote that I thought was incredibly insightful. I asked participants in my research, I said, can you tell me the difference in your mind? Is there a difference between religion and spirituality? Are they the same? Are they different? I didn't know. You know, I'm in my own little theological bubble here. So you don't know if you don't ask. And he said spiritual is better, and it's not even close. Not even close. He says one of those suggests you're seeking answers. One suggests that they are involved in the journey, and the other suggests they're not. To be spiritual is to mean you have an enlightened sense of self going on around you that you cannot explain, and you're trying to put a meaning or reasoning behind it. To be religious just means to me that you have marching orders. I think I learned as much from that quote as maybe I did writing my entire paper. Because I never looked at it like that. But the way the numbers trend in terms of spiritual and not religious and non-religious preferences and people who have left the mainline traditions and are now part of this non-religious preference segment, that seems to me to be something that is going to resonate. So as a Christian, the question I ask myself is, how much of my faith is about me being on the journey, actively seeking, actively pursuing, being a part of it? Because we all know those Christians he's talking about that just spit Bible verses or doctrine or whatever. To be religious means you just take marching orders. But if you're spiritual, you're a part of the process. So, we talked a little bit about where these nons come from. And really there's two options. There's two options where nons can come from. One is the church and religious world, like we've talked about. But the other is just secular culture. People who are born that way. And my opinion is that that is a growing segment. And over the next several decades, that's going to be more so the case. Now, there's many causes for what would make a person choose to be non or choose to leave the church, or even parents to no longer raise their children in church, which is how you get, more secular individuals. Causes can be, like the generic secularization. It can be social desirability. So, say in the 1970s, it wasn't so cool to get up and say you're an atheist. That's not going to get you invited to Christmas parties, right? It's going to kind of be looked down on. But with the rise of the internet, what happened in the mid-90s? With the rise of the internet, now people can find groups that are like them. They can find that community of like-minded persons. They can express themselves. And there's not as much of a social price to pay for being an atheist anymore. So that's what we mean by social desirability bias. As that has shifted, people are more willing to be open about who they really are. Politics can be a big thing. And just to kind of put a little point on that without getting into political conversation. So in 2018, for example, 98%, in 2018, 93% of all white Protestants, 93% of all white Protestants were in a church where Donald Trump had approval ratings of more than 40%. Not just mainlines, all white Protestants. Okay? But to compare that with, say, 1978, in 1978, half of all Democrats went to church. Fast forward to today, only 25% of Democrats go to church. This is just polling. Don't hate the messenger. I'm just giving you statistics, lay of the land. So you're 4 times more likely to be a non if you're not conservative. That's just the stats. So that's where sociologists look and say, how have these things contributed to this movement of non-religious preference, or people abandoning religion altogether? So we have data to back up how different groups have reacted and responded. Now, to be sure, more and more conservatives are becoming nones, especially the younger conservatives. But that's an example of perhaps in the 90s, when you had the contract with America and politics became aligned with one form of faith or one form of doctrine or theology, people who were more progressive or liberal felt like, I can't classify myself as Christian anymore because all the Christians think this. I've got to leave. That's kind of the story. And maybe some of you know folks like that. So, nones come from 2 groups, the religious world and secular culture. There was a book that Elizabeth Drescher wrote. She is a sociologist and does ethnography. She wrote a book. I actually brought it with me to show everybody. It's really insightful if you like these kinds of things. It's Interview and Orientation. It's Choosing Our Religion, The Spiritual Lives of America's Nones. And what she does in it is she interviews about 70 persons who identify as non-religious to just get a feel for why. How did it happen? What does this process look like for these individuals? What do they think? What do they hold dear? What do they value? What do their lives look like today? Why did they leave? And what she says is this. I have a quote here on my notes before we get to this quote here. She notes about being a non. She said, to be unaffiliated means simply that a person is not a member of an institutional group. Being a non is also a matter of social identity, of a person who understands herself most authentically to be in relationship to other people. So what that means is that being non-religious is more about social identity than necessarily personal theology. So people want to relate to people who think more like them. So they move over to this other group. So being a non is a matter of social identity and a person who understands herself most authentically to be in relationship to other people. So think about the nonning of America as people's relationship with one another, not necessarily their relationship to God, as 88% still believe in God. That's key. Okay? And then she says that the journey in which she interviews them is marked by this. The journey into being a non is also one of self-invention with words such as discovery, freedom, liberation, escape, self-realization, awareness, and growth. What struck me about that is that's the way I know a lot of Christians would talk about their relationship with Jesus. But people had to leave religion to talk about their personal quest in those ways. Discovery, freedom, liberation, escape. So think about the opposite of all those that instigated those movements for non-religious persons. And she breaks it down into the individuals she talked to that were nones. Most of them were people who had left a religious tradition. And she talks about evangelicals, mainlines, and Catholics. So the evangelicals she talked to that actually left the faith, usually it was over crisis or a conflict. It wasn't this internal struggle at first, but it was something that happened that was external to who they are. And there was a narrative in here I just want to read briefly, which kind of shows how intense this can be. She's talking to a gentleman who was homeschooled in a conservative tradition. And she writes this, that when he started taking classes in biology and geology instead of math and computer science classes for which he had been registered, the gentleman said this, "I felt like a chump. Here I was thinking I was smart. All the parents always brag about how much better homeschooled kids do on standardized tests. And I did well. I actually had a full academic scholarship. I was that smart. And I also thought that the universe was 6,000 years old." I actually believe that. And then in anger he says, "Who the expletive sends their kids into the world thinking that? What was wrong with my parents that they believed these domineering, self-deluded church leaders who told them to teach us this stuff?" He told his story better than I could have told it. So evangelicals, a lot of them leave out of crisis moments. It can be over intellectual crisis of Scripture, like this young man, where they gain new knowledge. It can be over hypocrisy by a lead church leader that falls, or a church leader that steals money. So it's something external that causes most evangelicals to leave, according to her findings. And her findings are qualitative in nature, not quantitative. Okay? Now, mainlines, this is us. She finds that most people who have left mainline churches do it out of boredom, because they've already learned all the lessons. They've already had all the same teachings. And words like childish and repetitive and "I've outgrown my faith" categorize conversations that she had with mainline Protestants. Not learning anything new. Once they get to college, or once their kids are old enough and now they got the moral guides, it's time to just go. Now the thing about this is, people that leave mainline church, they don't do it because they're mad. It's just something they gradually move into, encouraged to discover difference, and they begin to embody their religion in some different way, feeling they've outgrown this model. And then for Catholics, they usually leave because of a relationship break or severed trust. So what she found was that things that were wounded, people who were wounded by the church, or disagree with the church on stuff like sexuality or contraception or stem cell research, things like this, or a priest that let them down, lied to them, or let their family down during a really emotional, deep, dark time. So it's a relationship failure for most Catholics, because a lot of Catholics that leave, they still do their Catholicism. But they're going to be part of these people who identify as non-religious. They just do it in private and adapt it to their own personal spirituality. So that's a fascinating book if you want to learn more. But I wanted to give us a little taste of this first segment of nones that come out of churches, and just a quick overview of why they leave. Well, then we have what I call secular culture, and I get this from Charles Taylor. He was a personality that guided a lot of my research. Has a big book that he wrote called A Secular Age. And what he does in that book is he basically tells a story. Imagine your grandfather is a philosopher sitting around the campfire. He gathers you around and says, "Let me tell you a story that's 500 years old." That's how I think of Charles Taylor when I read him. And he wants to tell the story of how we go from 1500 to 2000. So how we go from a predominantly theistic world where God and the order of the heavens is reflected in the order of the world, and these two realms are constantly in dialogue, one impacting the other, to a world that has basically lost all sense of transcendence. So he tells a story from theism to like an exclusive humanism. That's what Taylor does in his work. And to frame his work, he talks about secular in terms of three ways. And the first one he talks about is a secular type 1. And the first secular is just the opposite of sacred. That's how I've been using it a little bit in this presentation. So you have the scholar and the monk, and you have the candlestick maker. One has the sacred occupation, one has the secular occupation. It's just a definition of kind, is all that it is. Then you have the secular that is a religious space. So this refers to a space that's religious free of religious conviction or presence. And it really talks about more political and civic spaces like we have in America, the wall of separation in church and state, where you have the civic space that's a-religious and neutral, and you have your church space that's influenced by your faith and your convictions. And we want to keep a nice tall wall between those, like Thomas Jefferson talked about in his letter to fledgling colonial Baptists. All right, so yeah, the secular kind, type 1, there's just kind in terms of references there, like occupation or station. You have a religious space, which we experience as people in the West, but then you have secular in terms of conditions of belief. And I believe this is what produces folks that are growing up outside of a specific religious framework. So this idea describes the movement in which you actually go from, like, what does the world look like where everybody assumes belief? What are the givens? What are the presuppositions? What does everybody think? What's accepted as knowledge? How do you get knowledge? How is that accepted? How do you go from that realm where everybody believes in God and doubt is the rare thing to an environment where doubt is now the prevalence? And our givens have changed. So that now even people who are religious, even we have our doubts. Because we grew up in this sort of secular era. So he wants to talk about secular as being the water we swim in. The ideas and the givens of the way we apprehend what's real. So now we apprehend real through science, through what I can observe, through what I can touch, through what I can reason. 500 years ago, theology could talk about what's real. Faith, things like metaphysics, those had a place as, not a second place, but a primary place in terms of how we apprehend what's real. So Taylor wants to talk about how we've now come to this secular age. And this age is marked, he defines it as an era in which any flourishing beyond humanity or the material world has been eclipsed. So the secular is an age in which any flourishing beyond humanity or the material world has been eclipsed. In other words, there is no final eschaton. There is no eschatology beyond what we can see. There is no new creation. There is no higher thing such as agape or the love of God. All human flourishing is right here. Nothing transcendent guides it. He says that's how we know we're in a secular age. So there can be atheists in a secular age, agnostics, people of faith who have a lot of doubts. We're all kind of secular now because the conditions in which we think and apprehend the world are conditioned by things like the Reformation and the Enlightenment and the Renaissance and the Industrial Revolution and space travel. All these things condition us that we don't choose. But it's the world that we're born into, that we're thrown into. Okay, the way we make sense of reality. So now there are people who are being born into this world and all the givens that come with it. That's also where non-religious persons come from. And final slide here, and then we'll open it up for some questions. So I think what I've been trying to paint the picture for us with some of these numbers, statistics, and a deep dive into them and where nons come from, and the dramatic shift we've seen in 40 years, is that we are in a new world of evangelism. We're in a new world of sharing our faith. When people walk into our church and watch the liturgy, what somebody born after 1996 thinks and sees is totally different than what all of us see. We're in the same building, but I promise you, we're not experiencing the same thing. James K.A. Smith, he actually wrote a usually books about books are not very good, but he wrote a book about the book. and it is superb. Best book about the book I've ever read. Okay? He says this on how not to be secular, engaging Taylor's work. He says, so you came to ministry with what you thought were all the answers to the unanswered questions all these secular people had. But it didn't take long for you to realize that the questions weren't just unanswered. They were unasked. Think about that. They were unasked. There doesn't seem to be anything missing from their lives. In other words, people don't wake up today with the assumption, I have sinned in my life and God needs to forgive that. For many of us, that was our assumption growing up. I better get right with God. I better come and take Eucharist. I better say my prayers of penance. That's not the way it is anymore. You thought you were moving into a world like yours, just minus God, but in fact, you've moved to a different world entirely. In the middle of the 20th century, probably about, I think maybe 1970s or 80s, Krister Stendahl was a Pauline scholar. He wrote a little book, one of the most influential books I read on the Apostle Paul, and it was called Paul Among Jews and Gentiles. Now, there was a movement in a lot of Pauline studies, or talking about Paul's letters, where a lot of scholars would read Paul through their own cultural lens and read things like Romans, and Paul comes out looking like a German Reformed Lutheran. And Stendahl was simply saying, look, Paul was not German, he was not Lutheran, he was not Reformed. Paul did not have the introspective conscience of the West that Martin Luther did. So if you read Luther, Luther is all about his own conscience and how awful he is and seeking God's forgiveness and acceptance. It's kind of it's a stereotype of Lutheran theology, I know. Forgive me, any Lutherans that are watching. But what Stendahl argues is that that's not the world that Paul was writing in. You can't read Romans that way. You got to read Romans like Paul is a first century Jew. That's the context for Romans. But I want to take Stendahl's analogy and push it further. Not only can we not come to Paul with the introspective conscience of the West and try to understand him in the first century with that lens alone, but we don't live in a world anymore where that introspective, guilty Lutheran conscience or Calvinistic conscience is active. So many people are waking up and they don't think anything is missing. That changes how we talk about the good news. Because we know how Jesus makes sense in that introspective conscience, guilt-laden world. How does Jesus work in a world with people who don't have any idea of the narrative framework? Who don't know stories about Cain and Abel and Samson and marching around Jericho and Elijah and the prophets, and can't name you one or two parables of Jesus? At least in the first century, Paul had paganism, where you could make some inroads. It was a very religious and pluralistic sort of environment. He could make some one-to-one correlations. But more and more, we have more people who don't have a similar story. Even though they believe in God, have high approvals of Christianity and profess Christianity, and think religion matters, there's not a lot of activity there underneath it. So I think what Smith here does is he really couches it into this new context. And I'm not going to have time to get into the Roman road, but I will bring it up as my final slide, and we can have just a couple of questions here. So those of you who are from more evangelical traditions, or maybe even Episcopalians used this years and years ago, but the Roman road was a bunch of Bible verses, for example, where if you want to share your faith, this is what you did. You went to Romans 3, then you went to Romans 6, and all these things about, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, etc. It's kind of like the biblical route to salvation for a lot of evangelicals and Protestants. But what's kind of happened with this method of sharing the gospel, because that narrative is absent and people don't assume it anymore, is the Roman road's kind of become like Route 66. It exists, but nobody knows why it's important anymore. And nobody travels it. And that's our context. So, do we have any questions in terms of...
When you talk about religion, the word, is that encompassing organized religion or like churches and synagogues?
All of it.
Okay, so it's...
Religion is marked by institutionalism.
Okay.
So in a lot of ways, what we see is not just the decline of religious preferences, but we also see in America the decline of institutional authority. So we talked a lot this morning about how these statistics, it could seem like I'm just doing it in an echo chamber, that it's only a church reality, but really, in fact, institutionalism on the whole is on the decline. You know, Ruritan Club, 4-H Club, you name it, you name the institution, there's not as much activity in culture anymore. And church has just been a part of that. Now, maybe there are some different reasons for why church has been exacerbated or why it happened in the particular way that it did from the 90s and then just sped up at the trajectory that it did. But what we're witnessing is that reality in conjunction with the decline in institutionalism. And the scary thing about that is institutions preserve our practices.
So when you were talking about how the decline came, obviously the millenniums, their parents, what caused that group? There's where the decline came, participating.
Mm-hmm.
Why did that decline? Because I've even heard kids this age say, my grandmother I used to go to church with, or, we just went everything. But they never talk about their parents. So why did the parents choose to leave the organizations?
I mean, it just depends on what reason that we talked about.
Oh, like social?
Is it political? Is it social? Is it a loss of trust? Did they become secular? Did they have a crisis where they just think it's all a bunch of hooey now and they don't want to subject their kids to it? Or, did they grow up I'll give myself as an example. I was an intensely religious young man, very sensitive. And I had some serious religious PTSD, undiagnosed, but PTSD over the book of Revelation as a kid growing up. Waking up in nightmares and sweats. I thought I was left behind 2 or 3 times, not even kidding. Walk around the house, where's mom and dad? Oh man, I've been left behind. I am in big trouble. And I didn't really want to subject my kids to that. That was a mixture of bad theology, but also it was a mixture of not understanding the depth of the riches of faith. But I didn't want to overlay them with the guilt that I was overlaid with. But the consequence has been, because I tried to save them from 15 years of my own working it out without being on a therapist's couch, I didn't want them to experience that same rough journey. But as a consequence, they don't know some of the Bible stories I know. Don't know why they're important. And they've been in church their whole life. Sitting in church, listening to sermons, and just not paying attention. So it's catch-22. So we got to be intentional about what we do with our children and how we talk about faith in our households. And if we want to continue the tradition, because Christianity, I forget the historian who said it, but Christianity is always one generation from extinction. If we don't share it, at least with one another, and then have a life that overflows. And we'll talk more about that in session 3. Any other questions? We got about 2 minutes. Yeah.
Just a question about kind of a statement you made. The decline in mainline specifically being mostly motivated, at least qualitatively around the about growing. And to me, that would signal institutional concern. Do you have any thoughts on what is or could be shifted to kind of help alleviate that sense of boredom or outgrowing this thing?
Yes.
Was that too big a question for you?
It's a big question, and I have a lot of strong opinions on it. But I will say we need lay people and clergy people with a robust theological imagination to read the Bible and the Book of Common Prayer for the first time again. And then to have a deeply intense relationship with God to the point that it overflows them and is contagious. I think we've lost our theological imagination. We see our Bible and our prayer book flat like prose. We don't see it like poetry. And that's what we got to do. That's a bigger problem that I can solve. I can only try and solve it in the things that I do and what I share with everybody else. But I think that's what it is. It's not because of lack of substance. The journey of faith is faith seeking understanding. You never graduate in your faith. You never arrive. You never learn all the lessons. But when we think of faith as a terminus, then we think we've somehow grasped it. But because, it's like Augustine talks about, faith seeking understanding, it's a constant seeking that is a journey. But it's a journey that you go back to the same stories and the same prayers, because you know that if you do that enough, God will use it, and God will shape you, and God will change you.
We've had this conversation several times.
I was thinking the same thing.
So the direct answer is, theological imagination.
And it just jumps at you. So,
Yeah.
But you have to hear it. You have to read it.
Right.
You have to know, and I think some of it is we don't allow it to be read in schools anymore. And people don't hear those stories. They don't read them. They don't have the context to see stories from the Bible in other readings.
Yeah.
I think I have a question in here somewhere. As far like on the previous slide, we had talked about spiritual and religious people. I'm a millennial, so that's like all my friends. And you were the quote before that.
It's all your friends.
A lot of them.
Okay. Yes. I want everybody here. She just said most of her friends are spiritual but not religious, and she's a
Even
millennial.
the ones that go to our church that we went to before this, they're spiritual, not religious, which makes church weird. And as far as like Romans Road being Route 66 now, because the questions are unasked. I don't know if the questions are unasked, they're just very different questions. Because if I went to my friend and was like, okay, but religiousness is death, and that was the life of Jesus Christ our Lord.
Right.
Be like, what do you talk like the wages of they don't really think about sin at all, but there's some reason that all of my friends are celebrating Avon, which is a pagan festival, that's pre-Christian. And and they'll talk about Christianity as it developed through the Celtic pagan tradition, they took from the pagan tradition. So that's really much more my roots anyway, before it was co-opted by Christianity and wrapped into this. So I'm just getting back to my spiritual roots, and it really answers more of. Does that make sense?
Right. So
they're just I don't know.
They're asking different questions. They're not asking the typical questions that were asked in 1950.
And we don't have the same definition, but sin is not defined the same way in these groups of people in this conversation.
Sure.
I can't talk about a presumption of understanding what sin means, or even what it means to be dead, not physically dead, but live in death versus live in life, and the source of life. There's a lot of terminology that's crept in, kind of a generational thought process within the spiritual but not religious group, and you're not navigating with the same lexicon or the same definitions of anything, and so there's not a presumption of a shared vocabulary.
Yes, right.
Which makes it infinitely more difficult to even talk. You can talk about the same thing and seem like you're agreeing, but both of you are agreeing to your internal definitions of what that means, and you actually don't agree.
We're both waking up in Cleveland, Tennessee, but we're using different maps to get around. We have different maps. And it's important that we understand that. But that's actually the perfect comment to end as I make a segue for next week. To let everybody know that this is where my particular research comes in. I'm going to share a lot of my research with you next week. And I'm going to talk about ways that we can connect with people that may not share the same map, the same conceptual frameworks, but that there may be some sorts of signals innate to what it means to be human that we can connect with people through that have transcendent origins. And we'll get more into that next week. So thank you so much for your kind attention. And,